everyone has decided, I guess, that COVID is over, so everyone wants to get together, which means I'm on the road again. While we're doing this, if you've got any questions, just feel free to interrupt me. We've got plenty of time, I hope. And if there's anything that I cannot answer, I'll jot down your contact information. I'll get back to you. It's a lot to hold in one person's head, and I've got a great team. But of course, we need to start with the war. On the right, we've got a population density map. And the lighter color of orange is, oh, sorry, it's on its side. So if you have to turn your head, this is the life of an author. You have to match the page rather than reality. So north is to your right. The lighter color of the orange on the right map is a population density that is about the same as Nebraska if you melon scoop out Lincoln and Omaha. So you will have neighbors, but you will not see them every day. The map on the left is a combination climate and economic map. So the green in the left, which overlaps the orange on the right, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's the only part of Russia that is sufficiently warm. The green is where people live in Russia. It's the part of the country that is just barely warm enough that you won't freeze off your nose on October 1. And it roughly overlaps with where people live. The blue that is on the right to the north, that's tundra and taigai, no one lives there. And the yellow to the left, to the south, is desert, and no one lives there. Now, when Russians look at this map, they get really depressed because they see all that kind of beige around the green, places that are flat enough that you can run a tank or run a horse through, but not sufficiently economically viable to actually live in. So it's territory that has to be patrolled with a population that is already stretched out. What the Russians have always been trying to do since the time of Catherine the Great is expand into these geographic barriers, places where it's pretty much impossible to invade through, and then forward position their troops into these gaps. These 9 gateway territories are the routes that all invaders have always used to attack Russian core territories. So 50-odd invasions in the last 500 years, all of them use one of these 9. During the Soviet period, the Russians controlled all 9 of them. Post-Soviet Russia went from 9 to 1. And most of what Russia has done during the Putin government has been about getting troops into those gaps. So this is the Kazakh police intervention. This is the Crimean War. This is the Georgian War. They now have 5 of them. And if they can grab Ukraine in its entirety, they will be one step away from having 7. That's what this is about. That's what this has always been about. And of course, scale matters. For those of you from Texas, Texas is not nearly as large as you think it is. The Russians are trying to do this with a population that is half that of the United States to plug gaps in a border system that's almost 3 times as long. They're always going to be mad about it. That's a map that is a little bit more accessible, so you can see what they're after. The bottom line here is that it's not just that the Russians are not going to stop until they control all of Ukraine. They're not going to stop until they've moved on past Ukraine into at least 5 NATO states. That's the why. Here's the why now. During the post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s, there was a baby bust, and there are less than half the number of people in their 20s today compared to people who are in their 30s today. You'll notice that it kind of rounds out a little bit below, suggesting that maybe their demographic situation is a little bit better in the future. But the Russians literally just found 8 million children about 7 years ago and threw them into the data. They weren't there the day before. So honestly, that gap probably then goes straight down. So the Russians are literally running out of people to do this. And if they didn't do it now, it was never going to happen. Now, a lot of people are like, why would the Russians be so paranoid? Why would the Russians feel that they had to do it now? It's really simple. They believe accurately in my mind that if they can't forward position to these gateways now, they will lose the capacity in the future. And the next time there's a real war of invasion, they will be fighting in an area where they have to defend a huge amount of territory and they can't concentrate any of their defenses. And that is a recipe for death because Russia doesn't have a bottomless population now. This isn't the 1940s. They would have to do it with what they have, and what they have is wildly insufficient. So let's talk about where we are right now. This is a map from April 3, but honestly, it hasn't changed a whole lot. Step 1, a northern invasion down to Kiev. Now, we all know that this kind of fell apart, but different sides took different lessons. Now, I know that the folks at DoD, when they saw this and they saw the convoy that was coming, the 40-mile convoy, and how it stopped after a day because they forgot to bring fuel, I know there's this initial bit of euphoria that, holy crap, we can totally take the Russians in a fight. And then everyone had a nap and thought about it, and confidence went to fear. Because now we know that if there's ever a direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russian forces, the Russian forces will be completely obliterated. And the Russians will have a choice between a broad scale retreat at all points of contact, probably back to maybe even beyond the pre-war borders, or escalation. So we now know we have to prevent that conflict from ever happening. So any system that we can send to the Ukrainians, anything they can operate themselves or that can be handled with like 48 hours of training, no more than that, they're getting. And people, NATO countries, are emptying out their stores. The Canadians have already run out of stuff to send, which, and I know, Canada doesn't have much of a military anymore, but still, we can't send them anything with a logistical tail, because a logistical tail would require American forces to defend it, and then we would have that direct confrontation. So there's a handoff in NATO countries, the Ukrainians drive it or train it or truck it or whatever happens to be from there. And that's now policy because we're rightly horrified of what will happen if we have that direct confrontation. Starting in the separatist territories in the east and Crimea, the convergence upon Mariupol. Mariupol is important for more than just a land bridge. There's a road nexus there that connects Russia proper into Crimea and on into the rest of Ukraine. And if the Russians fail to secure Mariupol to their liking, then the only way that the forces in Crimea can be resupplied is through a single bridge over the Kerch Strait. And now that the United States is sending longer range weapons into Ukraine, that bridge is not long for this world, which means that Mariupol will be the only way that the Russians can supply Crimea. Keep in mind that Crimea is not an agricultural region, so all the food for the entire population there has to be imported via Russia. And once they lose that one rail line over that one bridge, Mariupol is it. So if there's going to be a counterstrike that matters by the Ukrainians, that's where it has to go. And so the Russians feel they have to take that as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. We're going to have a couple pincher actions in attempting to hive off the regular Ukrainian army from everywhere else. I'd say that the Russians are actually doing a decent-ish job of doing that right now. And then the push that I'm most concerned about personally would start in Crimea and go over to Odessa. This probably can't happen until Mariupol is completely secured. But once they get to Odessa, they will have shut off all Ukrainian exports of all type, any chance of reinforcement from the sea, and then it's a short push to Moldova where they already have forces, and then Romania is just right next door. So that's kind of where I see the war going for about the next 2 months. The Ukrainians are definitely overperforming, and the Russians are definitely underperforming. But the war in eastern Ukraine now is it's an artillery battle. And this is literally what the Russians have preferred in their wars going back to World War I. And if they don't win that, then we can talk about a war scenario where the Ukrainians might actually win this. But everything in the war right now, in my opinion, is playing to Russia's strengths rather than its weaknesses. And I don't think we've begun to see the level of devastation that is really in store here. Because the lesson that the Russians took away from Kiev is that they can't capture this going softly. And so we're seeing a civilian obliteration program for all infrastructure. The idea being that if you level an urban area, people will fall into one of two buckets. They self-segregate. One group becomes refugees and they leave and you never have to worry about them again. And anyone who remains behind is a soldier and you can shoot them on sight. And we know from German radio intercepts that the Bucha massacres were not a one-off. That's happened dozens of times in Russian occupied territory. The Russians know they don't have the population at home to repopulate this area once they take it, and so they really don't care what happens to the civilian infrastructure. We've seen them going after absolutely everything with a special emphasis on cold chain logistics for food. grain storage, and they've done what they can to damage the port of Odessa already in terms of their offloading facilities. So when they're done, there is not going to be a whole lot left in any of the zones they've gone through. That's just what artillery wars are like. Okay, let's talk about the energy angle from the Russian point of view. The green lines are oil pipelines, the red lines are natural gas pipelines, and the dotted red along the western side of the former Soviet space is where the Russians ultimately would like to get to. First things first, the Turkish Straits. About 1.5 million barrels of Russian crude transit the Straits every year, and whenever it happens, the Turks often have to shut down traffic in both directions for some of the bigger tankers. The largest tanker that can make it through there is a 1 million barrel per day, so like a half super tanker. The Turks have activated the Treaty of Montreux that allows them to block the military passage of any belligerents at any time. Now, that means that the Russians right now cannot get their warships in and out. At the moment, the Turks are still allowing commercial cargo, but with a change in mind in Ankara, that could flip overnight. Rossiysk, this is the primary oil offloading facility for the Russians. It has the capacity to offload about 2 million barrels a day, but it usually doesn't operate any faster than about 1.4. It's in a war zone. It's in the northern half of the Black Sea. The Russians have hit a few ships. And a little quirk of maritime law is that when there's active shooters in the area, most private insurance companies like Lloyd's of London suspend all coverage for any vessels in the area, so the vessels don't go there because the ships are too expensive. The shipping companies can't afford a loss. So Novorossiysk has been operating below 20% capacity now since the beginning of the war. I don't expect that to increase. Up north, you have Primorsk, which is on the Baltic, almost as large as Novorossiysk, similar volumes, about 1.4. It's their second largest export point. Now, there's no war danger up here. The problem here is that shipping companies are refusing to go in, ship captains are refusing to go in, and most importantly, Primorsk is a shallow water port and can only take shuttle tankers. So if you want to, say, send crude to India, what you've got to do is put 6 or 7 shuttle tankers into Novorossiysk with your own sovereign indemnification, sail them out into the Baltic where it's deeper, roughly to Denmark, and then within sight of a NATO port, somehow get someone to bring out a half a dozen tugs to push 2 tankers together so you can offload from one to the other. That's a tall order. Some countries have done that and somehow think that the NATO countries are going to be okay with this in the long run. But that's the only way you can get the oil onto a tanker that is big enough to do a long multi-continental sail. Some have pulled it off, but certainly not the volume that we're used to seeing out of this port. Anywho, so Primorsk is probably operating about half capacity. Tengiz in Kazakhstan. One of the diplomatic deals that was cut with the Russians in the 1990s is they would allow oil from Tengiz to be exported using pipes that cross their territory, but only if they can put some of their own crude in it. And it all goes to Novorossiysk. So what's been going on recently is that the Russians have basically embargoed everything coming from Tengiz. They say, if anything's getting out of Novorossiysk, it's ours. So Tengiz is on the verge of shutting down already. It's already running at less than half capacity. And that's another 1.4 million barrels a day. These are the pipelines that are not long for this world, the ones that are either going through Ukraine proper or through Belarus. Now, the Germans have been getting a lot of crap, with good reason, that they are refusing an energy embargo because they have refineries in their capital region that date back to the Soviet era that are only supplied by pipe, that are not linked into any sort of port infrastructure. And so if these pipes go offline, we literally run out of fuel in Berlin. But here's the thing, at some point, one of 2 things is going to happen. Number one, in an artillery war, an artillery shell is going to hit the wrong thing and the pipe breaks. The Russians have already blown up part of Chernobyl on accident. Or number 2, the Ukrainians are going to blow up their own infrastructure, either before they fall or after they fall as a partisan war in order to stick to the Russians and prevent the income. So one way or another, all of these pipelines are going to be shut down. Now, the problem with all of this is that this isn't the Permian Basin in the United States. This isn't the North Sea. This isn't Saudi Arabia. This is Russia. And most of their oil's in the permafrost. Now, in the summer, permafrost is swamp, but permanent. You go down subsurface and it's always frozen. And if you push liquids through a frozen layer in a pipe, as long as the liquids are moving, they stay liquid. But should the pipes slow, should the flow stop, as happens when, say, pipelines get blown up or people stop offloading facility or offloading cargo, and so there's more pressure in the pipe. If that pressure builds up all the way back to the pipe, the liquid freezes and the wellbore cracks, and that well cannot be used again. You have to re-drill. We've seen over a dozen refineries within the Russian territories already slow or stop their operations because they don't have any way to get rid of the gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, whatever it happens to be that they've refined. And so they're slowing their uptake. So we've seen Russian exports and Russian consumption combined drop from somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million barrels a day already. And we're getting to the point where that pressure is already reaching the wellhead. And if it gets to the point that they have to shut it down, it doesn't just shut down until they decide to turn it back on. It shuts back down forever. Now, the last time the Russians had to shut in anything, it was 1992. Cold War had ended. Russian industry had collapsed, but Russian energy production continued until the pressure built up back to the wellhead. They had to shut it in. It took them 32 years to get it all back online. They didn't finish until December of 2021. So we're not talking here about Russian energy going off for a short period of time. We are talking about Russian energy going offline for decades, because the only way the Russians were able to bring that all back online was with help from the oil services firms. And now that Schlumberger and Baker Hughes and Halliburton are taking a moral stance on Russia, which is something I don't think anybody saw coming, this is it. We're going to lose 4 to 5 million barrels a day of Russian crude and another million barrels a day of Kazakh crude within the next 2 months. And it's just going to be gone. So that's the single largest disruption to oil markets ever. And it's just around the corner. Then there's natural gas. We're going to be having a point at some point in the summer where these two pipelines are going to become very important. In the north, that's Nord Stream, which goes subsea Baltic direct to Germany. In the south, we have Blue Stream, which goes subsea under the Black Sea to Turkey. These two pipes are broadly immune to the rest of the problem, certainly to the problem that the oil system is having. And so once those other pipes go offline, the Russians are going to be able to go to Berlin and Ankara and say very clearly and very accurately, look, we can keep the fuel flowing for you, only for you. But it comes at a cost, and it's not to be paid in rubles. It's to be paid in security concessions. You need to stop participating in the NATO alliance that helps Ukraine. And if we lose access to the Turkish Straits and the logistics hubs in Germany, that is the end of American support for Ukraine. Now, if you had asked me on February 21, the day before the war started, what these two countries would have done, I would have said 100% that they will cave, because they have caved to the Russians on any energy or security related question for the last 30 years. I misjudged. I think a lot of people did. And so now I'd give it a 50-50 chance. So we're talking about a scenario where a lot of Germany's already shutting down, and this prevents the lights from going out. But then again, we have seen more cohesion among the Europeans so far in this war than we have seen in Europe since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1066. We really are in strange times. If you're looking for things to worry about, these are issues where Russia plus Belarus plus Ukraine as a unit, and I think we need to start thinking of them that way, economically at least, are the world's largest supplier, second largest supplier, or third largest supplier. Ukraine doesn't produce a lot of oil or natural gas. Most of that's Russia. But number one in natural gas, number two in crude, number three in coal. I mean, this is kind of a big deal, with the possible exception of coal, because there's multiple ways you can ship that. The rest of this is largely going offline. Let's say you're a green warrior. Well, you're screwed too. There is no way that we can execute the green revolution or the energy transition or however you call it without the Russians. Copper and platinum are two big ones. Uranium, if you decide you want to go that route. Aluminum is you need for a frame for any sort of EV system. It's just one of the things that people haven't really wrapped their heads around right now is, while yes, we can't have inexpensive, globally accessible oil without the Russians, we also can't have the green transition without them. We just don't have the materials input. Copper, it's probably the single biggest one there. And then over to nickel, next one down, because nickel's in both categories. Nickel is not only a core critical component for green tech, it's also core for making stainless steel. And the Russians are the world's largest semi-finished iron or pig iron producer. Not everybody does steel the same way. So in places that are a little bit more nationalistic, China, India, Germany, France, what happens is they buy the iron ore, they put it into a smelter, they melt it into semi-finished or pig iron, and then they further process it to get the steel that they use within their system. It's very vertically oriented. The United States is different. We have become a little bit more blasé about where we get the various components of our supply chains for this specific product. And so for environmental reasons, we've shut down all of our steel smelters. So we let someone else do that. And then we import the intermediate product, the pig iron or the semi-finished iron. And then we turn that into the best steel in the world. Well, Russia plus Ukraine are 2/3 of global pig iron supplies. Now, we do get a lot from Brazil, we do get a fair amount from Mexico, and we certainly recycle all kinds, but we're still looking at about a 20% in a reduction of our ability to access that intermediate product that we need to do everything else. So the United States is actually one of the countries that's likely to feel a bigger pinch from the steel category than anyone else. Wheat, the world's #1 wheat exporter, has invaded the world's #4 wheat exporter and is going through a civilian infrastructure obliteration program. It is highly unlikely that the Ukrainians will have a harvest season this year. I mean, I'm shocked they've been able to plant as anything, much less as much as they have. They're probably going to get in the ground about 2/3 of what they had compared to last year, so that's not bad. Harvesting it is going to be a bit of a bitch. This has already doubled the price of wheat. And the last time we had an energy interruption out of the former Soviet space, we had the glory of the Arab Spring, because that's where the majority of this region's wheat goes. And the Middle East is heavily dependent on subsidies to make everything work. So in 2010, when this went down, global wheat prices doubled, but in the Middle East, they tripled. Well, they've already doubled globally. And we're probably going to see them double again by the fourth quarter when it becomes apparent just how bad the harvest is going to be. So we should be prepared for an Arab Spring-like series of protests and coups and civil wars. Remember, this is how the Syrian civil war started too, because in relative terms to 2010, it's going to be at least 2 or 3 times as expensive as it was 12 years ago. And as much as that worries me, and it does, the one that terrifies me. Russia is not just the world's largest exporter of fertilizer of all types. It is also the world's largest exporter, 40% of the total, for potash, that specific subset of fertilizer, and the second for ammonia, which is used in making nitrogen-based fertilizer. So not only are we losing the food direct, the world is losing a lot of what allows the food to grow in the first place. So the food price increases we've seen to this point are nothing compared to what's happening. There are a lot of parts in the world that simply aren't going to be able to use fertilizer this year, and based where you are, that either reduce yields by half to 80%. It really depends on the soil type. The biggest loser, again, is the Middle East. Second is a tie between Brazil and South Asia. Both of them are heavily dependent upon the former Soviet space for their fertilizer. Now, the Brazilians aren't going to starve. They're so agriculturally productive. They're the world's second largest exporter, but they export world over, and those exports are just going to shrivel this year. South Asia, that's where you're talking about famine kicking in potentially. I'm particularly worried about Pakistan, but India worries me as well. Third is sub-Saharan Africa. They take some food, they take some fertilizer, but luckily, if that's the right word, sub-Saharan African agriculture has not fully industrialized. So if they lose the industrial inputs, it won't be as much of a disaster as it will be in a place like South Asia. So those 4 regions I'm really worried about. And by the fourth quarter of this year, they're going to be under extreme pressure. And then the year after, once we chew through our wheat stocks and chew through our fertilizer stocks, it'll be even worse. So we're just getting a taste of what's to come in the end of this year.
Hey, Mr. Zeihan, here. May I ask you a question, please?
Go for it.
All right, and so it goes back to your previous comment concerning the green transition. So if we need Russia for the green transition, and you communicated that, the oil disruption from Russia is significant, do you see a peace deal as being something that we can achieve? Is that possible? No. And if it is,
the Russians are not interested in a peace deal. The Russians literally see this as an existential crisis, and I think they're reading the geography and the demography correctly. This really is their last chance. So any talk of a peace deal is going to have to be on Russian terms. The complete dismemberment of the Ukrainian military, a constitutional change to forswear membership in the EU and NATO, a demilitarized system, and the ability of the Russians to station troops in Ukraine wherever they want. And even if we get that deal, they're still going to come for Poland.
Wow. So, okay. I guess I'll save my other question for the rest of your talk. Thank you.
Okay. I'll get more in transition, but go ahead. Yeah, please.
On the other side of what you have, these seem to be levers for the Russian Belarusian set. What levers does the United States and the rest of the world have to use against Russia?
In terms of economically?
Well, with any of these things here to use against them or their government.
Oh, gotcha. The Russians kind of celebrate privation in the same way that we do apple pie. So in order to hurt Russia economically, I don't think we are capable of causing the level of pain that will cause them to shift gears. I think the best example I can give you is the Crimean War of the 1850s. In that war, the Russian system was not sufficiently militarized, industrialized, barely at all. So when the war happened, the Brits and the French were coming in with steamships that were steel. The Russians still had sailing ships that were wood. The French and the Brits had sufficient steel that they had artillery and mass production of rifles that had a range of over 1,000 yards, while the Russians were still using muskets. We had early antibiotics in the Western countries and field hospitals to prevent death from infection or disease. The Russians did not. And so the Russians got obliterated. They lost 500,000 troops. And in the end, they had to surrender because they literally couldn't ship troops to the field of battle. It's going to have to be something like that. We have to do this until the Russians cannot fight, because diplomatically and strategically, they don't see a problem here with the way the war is going to this point. I mean, would Putin like the Russian forces to do better? Yeah, but the Russians always underperform in the first year of a war. And then it becomes an artillery fight and a fight of numbers, and then the math changes. So the only way that Russia stops is if we turn Ukraine into a killing ground that destroys the Russian military's capacity to function. And we are nowhere near that yet.
So I guess I'm wondering, are they going to lose their capacity to feed their own people?
I don't think so. They can't operate a lot of the oil fields, especially the further east you go. That's really dependent upon the services firm. So it's a question of how fast that goes offline. And they've certainly have expanded what they call enterprise farms over the course of the last 15 years. And those enterprise farms are responsible for almost all of their exports. But even if you remove the support infrastructure intellectually for those two things, this is still a country with a lot of food and a lot of oil. So the lights are going to stay on, the trucks are still going to run, and there's still going to be food on the table. It's going to be Russian food without all the imported stuff that's higher quality for sure. The Russians will see their standard of living drop significantly. But I don't think we're looking at any sort of Russian famine or any sort of Russian energy crisis internally. That's one of the big advantages of the Russian system is they export a lot of the things you need to function. And at least at this point, that's the world's problem more than it's Russia's.